Hi, everyone. My name is Gonzalo Schwarz, and I'm the president and CEO of the Archbridge Institute. Thank you very much for joining us for this terrific interview with Dr. Glenn Loury. Glenn is the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences at the Department of Economics at Brown University and the host of a great show called The Glenn Show on bloggingheads.tv. During this interview, we discuss various current events regarding the pandemic, race, income inequality, income mobility, and the American dream. I hope you enjoy the program. And if you would like more information about our work, please visit archbridgeinstitute.org. Thank you very much.
So, what do you think are some current and future effects of the pandemic and the protests on inequality and mobility in America? What's currently and looking a little bit into the future?
Oh, that's such a huge question. I imagine there will be many dissertations written. It's a pretty extraordinary natural experiment. I mean, I think it's more or less exogenous to almost anything that you would want to know the effects of. So you've got a shock. I'm not an empiricist, as you may have already figured out by now. I read the empirical literatures, but I'm basically a conceptual and theory type guy. So I will not be doing any of these quasi-experimental research papers. I think of a couple of things. One in education is the disruptive effect of transitioning from in classroom to the distance learning, and whether that human capital forming process is more set back for kids who do not have complementary resources like attentive parents or stability in their social environment, or who do not have the internal motivation that will be needed to get them to focus on their work when they're not within the rigors of a classroom environment and a structured school day. So, one of the things that I would be, and I imagine it will be looked into, there is this old idea that the kids make progress during the school year, and then in the summer that it attenuates somewhat, but the 2 or 3 months that they're away from class, and then they come back. This pandemic is like a kind of suspension of the formal process, and it might affect kids differently. I don't know. Maybe that's not a very interesting observation, but it's one thing that occurs to me. There is a differential incidence of the mortality and morbidity associated with the infection across different strata of society based on occupation or residential location or socioeconomic position. So those inequalities may be exacerbated by the fact of the pandemic. There's a huge economic effect here with the artificial unemployment from the suspended business activity. A natural place to look, it seems to me, would be to ask about how that shock is maybe being felt more negatively at the bottom end of the spectrum. But I don't know. I'm just speculating now. I don't really have anything further to say about that.
Oh, I get it. No, it's very similar to what I'm thinking. Like, if there's any inequalities now as well, they're gonna be looking to the future, maybe exacerbated because of some of those issues you mentioned. So that's perfect. The second question, I'm gonna just skip the beginning. But in your commentary, you often emphasize the need for people to understand themselves as free actors who can shape our lives according to our ideas and conviction. What does the mainstream conversation miss when it comes to thinking about agency, human agency, and how would you like to see that conversation change?
Well, I mean, I think there's a philosophical and dimension to this problem of agency, and then there's a kind of behavioral dimension to the problem. And my arguments have mainly been at the level of the philosophical dimension to the problem of self-determination, self-governance, self-ownership, self-responsibility. I mean, I've been making this in the context of talking about racial disparities and being concerned that some of the popular discourse, in effect, deprives African Americans, Black people, of agency by asserting a kind of historical determinism rooted in the past discrimination against African Americans and slavery, segregation, redlining, this kind of thing. I could name the names, I won't name them, of popular writers who've created quite a stir by, in one way or another, articulating this sense of African American marginality being a permanent, necessary consequence of the structures of American society, of the legacies of the historical domination of, quote, Black bodies, seeing in high rates of incarceration of African Americans in the year 2020, the present day effect of the age-old domination of African Americans that goes back to slavery, seeing one or another deficit in human capital acquisition and wealth acquisition and economic status as being the necessary consequence of the historical domination of Blacks. So I've been worried that a posture of political advocacy and also a kind of self-understanding on the part of African Americans, which overemphasize this legacy as being determinative of the future prospects of African Americans, that a sense that the only way out is that racism should be ended, that the historical, reparations should be paid. These are all arguable questions and depend on what area. If you're talking about police behavior, it's one thing. If you're talking about the labor market, it's another thing. If you're talking about the housing market, it's another thing. Credit market, it's yet another thing. But and so there will be arguments, how much racism and so on. But the philosophical posture, the kind of existential stance that leaves the fate of African Americans to be determined by these historical forces, I've wanted to object to that. That's not a way to live with dignity. These are not economic science words, the words dignity and, what should be our value structure and all of that. But I think they're important words even so, and I think in discussing inequality, maybe we economists can learn a little something, beyond our empirical analysis, because equality of status, equality of dignity and respect, equality of standing, equality of reputation, equality of achievement, equality of a sense of confidence, of belonging, of worth. These are not fungible things that you simply can tax somebody, take it away and give it to somebody else, and then you have equal. Some of these things are, I think, very subtle things. And I think dependency for African Americans, now I speak about race, about racial inequality, about persistent racial inequality, and about racial equality of standing and dignity. Mm-hmm. For African Americans to be in the position of petitioning this grievance narrative, this woe is me, I've been a victim yet again. People are too quick, I think, often to rush to that particular posture, and they invite patronization. They invite being treated like children, being subject to, well, we know that we couldn't really expect that you would pull your own weight. We couldn't really, given your history has been so horrible, we're so sorry, this kind of thing. I don't want to overstate this. I don't want to dwell in it, but I'm answering, I say there are two parts to this question about about agency, and one of them I think is philosophical, and I'm just trying to describe the philosophical part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Now, another part of the problem, which I don't claim to know as much about it as I probably should know about what data would say about efficacy, about human behavior, about the extent to which, you know, people are resilient, about whether or not they believe that their effort will overcome their, whatever the deficit is. People can have different beliefs about these kind of things psychologically. And that may have very important material consequences. It might mean that a certain deficit or disadvantage, let's say being born into a single parent home or in a neighborhood where there are not many fathers, or where there's criminal activity or gangs or whatever, being in a peer group that doesn't value academic achievement and has values on other things that are less economically remunerative. It may be that the way an individual navigates such circumstances depend a lot on these psychological factors, and a sense of agency, of efficacy, of being in command of one's own fate may be one such. And hence, there could be positive behavioral implications of fostering a greater sense of agency. There could be a whole program of trying to understand what it is about early education and socialization that's associated with adolescents coming to think about themselves as being capable of shaping their own futures, things of this kind. That would be more of a behavioral side of the question. And so I'd respond to you in that way.
Yep, no, that makes a lot of sense. And we could definitely do more as economists to try to think more in those terms, because that's definitely, as I say, guide a lot of behavior, or just thinking about human flourishing more generally. I'm gonna skip for now the question about the elections, because that's too political for now. Just continuing the sort of in the same topic. So in some of your work, you have referenced the developing thesis and how that should be how we can better address inequalities as they relate to race. Could you summarize that thesis in a few lines, and why do you think it's more important than other explanations, or if you think that it's...
Sure, I do think it's more important. So the thesis is to distinguish between bias against Black people and as a source of the persisting disparity in economic outcome. Bias and the development of the capacities of Black people as an alternative way of trying to approach and comprehend the persisting disadvantage. I mean, these are just words, so I use them to frame a large area of many different kinds of factors that you might look to. Discrimination isn't only one thing, neither is human development only one thing. But basically, just to cut right to the chase, to not mince words, I'm talking about the supply side and the demand side of the labor market. You know, take the labor market as an example. I'm saying I see wages that are on average lower after I've controlled for a few crude things. I control for more things or different things. You know, if I'm Derek Neal and William Johnson, I control for some early cognitive ability measure, and young men's wages, maybe I can account for quite a bit of the racial difference in those wages by controlling for those few things. But I'm seeing this disparity. Now, the demand side is, what do employers do? I'm giving the example of the labor market, but the observation would apply more broadly. The supply side is, what do the workers do? I don't observe as an econometrician all of the characteristics of the workers that employers might observe that are relevant to the productivity of the worker, which in the absence of discrimination could explain differences in wages. There's some stuff on the supply side. There's some behavioral stuff. There's some human capital stuff. There's some cognitive ability stuff. There's some socialization and you know, attitude and stuff. There's the characteristics of the worker. And then there are, you know, the way jobs are structured, you know, who gets to control the workplace, how is the internal labor market managed, what is the wage setting process, who's in a union, et cetera. That's on the demand side. And I'm just saying, when I look over the long history of the 20th century and the change in status, economic status of African Americans through that period, my sense of it a consumer, not a producer of this empirical literature, but an avid consumer of it, my sense is that the demand side accounts don't take us very far in understanding the persistent disparity. And that we really have to look on the supply side. We have to look at schools. We have to look at test scores amongst other things, amongst many other things, but that would be one of the things that I would be wanting to look at. We have to look at behavior. And I'd even be willing to go further. We have to look at attitudes and values. We have to look at commitments and beliefs and so on, which are also a part of the picture. Okay, so supply side as distinct from the demand side. Development of the human potential of people reflected in their productivities and the way in which they present themselves in society and their effectiveness as persons, versus the exclusionary actions, the structured oppositions, the impediments that are a residue of a history of racism. So it's the development side that I'm focusing on. And the reason I think this is important is that if the intervention is motivated, if the process of intervention is driven by a hunt for a non-existent villain, racial discrimination on the demand side of the labor market, the problem won't be addressed. And I think the problem being the disparity in the outcome. We want to close the disparity, but if we don't look in the right place for the source of the disparity, we're never going to actually close the disparity, and that is so that's my concern. So that's the general idea of identifying on the supply side of the labor market the process of the maturation of people into more or less productive workers whose wages are then determined by their productivity, versus a structure of taste or statistical or historical and structural discrimination, which undervalues the labor of the Black workers given their productivity.
I think this sort of builds into the next question in terms of what kind of public policies do you think would be most effective in closing racial gaps in wealth, income, and income mobility, and what kinds of public policies are least effective or could even be counterproductive to it, that are either being suggested or are currently happening?
Well, policy, I'm going to say human capital side, supply side policies. I'm going to think about schools. I'm going to think about early childhood education. I'm going to think about the kind of things that people who evaluate these programs and try to get cost benefit estimates on the returns to early life intervention look at. Again, I'm not an empiricist. I read some of these papers, so I know about some of this work. What I'm about to say is political. It's not a scientific claim. I think there are many pieces of scientific evidence that bear on it. I think schools that serve poor people in the United States are less effective than they could be. I think there's a huge argument, intellectual and social scientific argument, but also political argument around, vouchers, school choice, empowering parents, charter schools, and so on. And there's been something of a stalemate, although, I've been around for a while, and I know that the charter school movement, it has many people who are very powerfully committed to it, and it's come a very long way. But the battle over the provision of educational services to disadvantaged Americans, in my mind, should loom every bit as large as the battle over the provision of public safety via the police, which is the theme of the day, as it affects Black Americans. So I want to see the cognitive development of these youngsters enhanced. And that's not going to come for free, although money may not in every instance be the principal obstacle to that enhancement. I'm impressed by some of the research that I've seen out of Roland Fryer I don't know if you know this paper about the schools in Houston. This paper, I think it's in the JPE, or maybe it's in the QJE. It's in the QJE. It basically does a quasi-experimental intervention in public schools in Houston, where he's able, with his team, to implement a charter school-like curriculum with a longer school day, with very high standards for teachers, with discretion over hiring and firing of teachers, with tutors, intensive investment in tutors, with a curriculum that's designed very much for the 3 R's of reading, writing, and math and whatnot, with high expectations. There's a list of these characteristics of it uses the KIPP academies, the Knowledge is Power charter school academies, as a template, as a base. And he finds substantial causal effects, improving the cognitive achievement of youngsters. That's a random assignment kind of design. Some of the schools implement the modified curriculum and protocols, others do not. He's able to look over a couple of years at test scores of the students and see some very substantial, I think it's something like half of a standard deviation in the math score, mean math score performance of the students in the treated schools, this kind of thing. But so that would be one thing.
Excellent. Switching gears just a little bit, looking back on just the last decade, do you think that conversations on race in America have improved or gotten worse? And are you more or less optimistic about the potential for positive change than you were 10 years ago, or no?
I think it's gotten worse. And I say that knowing that many people would feel that it's only just started. It's getting better. Now we're finally having the conversation. They would look to the movement of the Black Lives Matter type enthusiasm, the protests engendered by police killings of Black men and women. And they would say, finally, we're getting going. But I don't agree. I actually think that President Obama missed a great opportunity. This is a very controversial thing that I'm about to say, because he's the first Black president. And I thought that there were aspects of what he was trying to say to Black Americans that, for example, through his My Brother's Keeper initiative. I'm not now talking about a evaluation of a program that has quantitative evidence favoring the effectiveness of the intervention. I'm talking about social entrepreneurship, where you're thinking outside the box about different ways of approaching and talking about and framing questions. So he says, our young men, these are Blacks, he's the president of the United States, so he's speaking for the government, but he's also speaking as a civic leader, a communal leader, as well as a political leader. Our young men need encouragement, they need support, they need resources, they need guidance, they need inspiration, they need role models and ideals. They need to be inspired, to be shown a better way of living, this kind of thing. I'm not sure I'm quoting him, but I think I have captured the spirit of what it was that he was trying to say. And I thought that did a couple of things. Of course, one doesn't want to, and the feminists would be the first to object, one doesn't want to simply talk about men in the exclusion of an entire community. But if you were to look at, the statistics of social dysfunction and such, and you see what's going on especially in the lower classes of African American social life, it's not an entirely crazy thing to ask the question, what's going on with our boys, what's going on with our men? I'm talking about violence, incarceration, criminal participation, school failure, various kinds of behavioral malfunction. So that was one thing, focusing on a part of the problem. Another thing was about this issue of agency. Now I'm speaking not only of personal agency, but of communal agency, a sense that those of us who are concerned about these matters can somehow, by forming a consensus and kind of developing a narrative and a discourse, can shift the conversation. I thought that was all very good. He was able, I think, I'm speaking now of Obama. You've asked me how has race politics shifted in the last decade, and I'm trying to respond to that.
That's perfect. Yeah.
He was in a unique position to be able to say things that no one else could really say effectively. You wouldn't question his bona fides in terms of him being racist for engaging in any kind of discourse that if a white person were to engage in, that might be the first thing people would say. You wouldn't say that about him. His heart was more or less in the right place, you might say. But I think it was the minor note of the President Obama's race portfolio, this My Brother's Keeper. It was a minor note. And I think he may have been overtaken by events. The events being the killing of Trayvon Martin in Florida, the events being the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, the events being the rise of the Black Lives Matter enthusiasm amongst African Americans. Maybe he was overtaken by the events of civil disturbances in Baltimore after Freddie Gray died in police custody, and there were riots that broke out. Overtaken by events like the fierce opposition that he faced amongst conservative Republicans about the racial backlash that, to the extent that existed, and I think it did exist to some extent, that came from the right against him as president. Somehow that moment was lost, a moment when the conversation might have been shifted. Instead, and I don't fault the president, former president, for this, I just use him as a point of departure for this larger observation. Instead, we got the rise of this racial politics of grievance and avoidance of responsibility, of what I think is a highly oversimplified socio-historical account of contemporary circumstances with respect to race in the United States, which basically says you had slavery from the year 1619, you had emancipation, which was really a joke because Reconstruction got snuffed out before it had a chance to have any effect. You had a long, dark night of Jim Crow exclusion and Black subordination that was not really reversed by the, there's this kind of brief glimmer of reform and whatnot, which was the civil rights movement, but which has now been eclipsed by the latter day 21st century systemic racism, which is all the rage. And you got that. And I think that's really very bad. I think it's very, very poisonous when, I'll just give one example. This is political, it's not economics, and I just have one opinion. Okay, so there are other opinions. I give one example. So a prominent football player is upset about the killing by police officers of Blacks in American cities. And he decides to kneel during the playing of the national anthem. This becomes a great controversy. Even the president of the United States weighs in on it. It's a big controversy. But my question is, why is the legitimate, you can protest police behavior. This is perfectly legitimate. Why is the national celebration of the ceremony of patriotism, of an affirmation of the commonness of the country and whatnot, the site, the place where you make this protest, the country is not besmirched. The entire country, the enterprise, the idea that you were, Gonzalo, extolling when you say you believe in the American dream. What does Ta-Nehisi Coates, the writer, write in his book? He says the American dream is a joke. He says it's a laughingstock. It never applied to Black Americans. Now, my thought is, you're asking me about the status of racial discourse, and the identity politics is very, very sharp now, and it has us quite divided. And people talk about white America, and they talk about white police officers, and they race is right at the front of things. My sense of it is that we'd be so much better off if the national project were to be able to take precedence over the racial communal project, even for Black Americans. Now, of course, that means the national project has to be worthy of being affirmed. I think on the whole, the American National Project is worthy of being affirmed. I think you can argue about whether or not it's a just social provision that people don't have the resources to get healthcare that they need in order to be able to prosper in their lives, about how much and in what form support to people who don't have enough to eat or don't have shelter should be provided, about whether and to what extent racial diversity is a goal that should be pursued with one or another kind of affirmative. All these things are debatable, but the basic national project is healthy. There should be no distance between African American aspiration for full inclusion within the society and an affirmation of the overall project. And I think that's very far from being the case now. So I'm relatively pessimistic about the way things are going, because the narrative, whether you look at how the New York Times decides to talk about the American founding via its 1619 project, or you look at how people are responding in all kinds of institutions, commercial institutions, businesses who have markets and brands to worry about, academic institutions, universities that have become very, very politicized of late. You had a candidate lose an election in Georgia for governor. It was a Democratic election. It was a fair election. She lost. Refused to concede the election based on a theory about what she calls voter suppression. I'm talking about Stacey Abrams. I'm talking about this election in Georgia of a couple of years ago. And I'm saying, is that what we've come to? That based on racial dissension, we are no longer prepared to concede the legitimacy of the deliberative democratic process by which we elect people to office? That way lies deep trouble for our democracy, it seems to me. I don't want to overstate this, but when I pick up the New York Times, or when I pick up the Village Voice, or when I pick up the Nation, or I pick up whatever, and I see essays telling me rioters are justified to burn down the small business on the corner from their house because they're angry about systemic racism. And by the way, if you try to protect your property against someone who's violently attacking it, that's a form of violence in and of itself. It's like putting property above Black lives. You think property is more valuable than Black lives. This is the unraveling of the social order. If this point of view becomes a very widespread, a very widely embraced point of view. So that's going to sound conservative, because I think it is kind of, you say you were educated, Gonzalo, at George Mason. I kind of know what those people are. Property rights probably figures pretty highly in the foundation of civil order and economic prosperity. From that way of looking at it, it figured pretty high at MIT back in the 70s when I was educated too. So.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for that. Yeah, it's quite disturbing how we're not close to thinking that it should be the same conversation, the same project. But yeah, sort of related to that, since nuance can be hard to come by in many of these conversations, what are some of the main points that intellectuals, activists, and commentators most concerned about systemic or structural racism tend to miss? And conversely, what points are often missed by people who deny any form of structural or systemic racism?
Okay, yeah, those are good questions. So I'm going to go back to my developmental point. I think the people who focus on systemic racism don't acknowledge, I think, sometimes the developmental role of inadequate development in impeding African-American success. I want to give an example, school discipline. So this is the battle of the letters from the Department of Education to the local school districts around the country by two successive secretaries of education, one serving President Obama and one serving President Trump. So the Obama Education Department, on noticing a racial disparity in the frequency with which children were disciplined, including being suspended from school for behavior, with blacks being disciplined at a higher rate, in effect, warned these local education departments that they could be in danger of being disqualified for federal assistance by the Office of Civil Rights of the U.S. Department of Education if they didn't do something to narrow the racial disparity in the incidence of these punishments, which were taken ipso facto to be evidence of racism, of discriminatory treatment. And I don't have the number in front of me, but it could be easily found, the disparity, say proportion of boys suspended at least once during a school year in a recent year. It could be something, I don't know the number exactly, but I'm going to say from memory, it could be something like 15% of the black boys and maybe 3% or 4% of the white boys. Again, the number could be looked up. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm thinking, okay, so then the Republican comes along, Trump and his Secretary of Education, and they decide to rescind. So they send a letter around basically withdrawing the position that the Obama people have put out there. And I'm thinking, well, if indeed there is a systematic pattern of differential treatment of black youngsters resulting in suspension or other school discipline, that would be a horrible form of discrimination, and it should be attacked. On the other hand, if there really are wide differences of the disruptive behavior manifest by students which result in discipline, and that black kids are acting out in a disruptive way more frequently, for which reasons could be given about socialization and discipline and inculcation of self-restraint and whatever. I mean, there could be reasons, including they may be acting out against what they regard to be a racially oppressive school system, although I would require to be convinced of that. But in any case, if we don't attend to those developmental problems, then my God. So this tendency, then my God, we will have locked in the inequality and only papered over it by attributing it to the false source, namely the discrimination of the school district, when in fact it was the inadequate behavioral development of the youngsters who happen to be black, which was the real problem. There's a lot of stuff that's like that. Every disparity by race is not in and of itself a reflection of discrimination, and the tendency that I think progressives have to act as if this were so is very mischievous. The other side of this would be easy to give. The other side of this would be the person who says there is no racism anywhere and who overlooks, the practices that are remediable, as for example, might be the case with respect to police behavior in certain circumstances. But that the critic wants to write off as they brought it on themselves, there's no problem here.
There. Let me switch to the last two questions, which some people, as you mentioned, might say that the other ones were a little bit more, sometimes more controversial, but I think these last two maybe could lend themselves to be a little bit more out there for some people. But the last two, with this one, your colleague, John McWhorter, has referred to some of the more extreme examples of wokeness as a kind of religion. Do you agree with that characterization? And do you see this as related to the ongoing decline of religion in the traditional sense? Or
I think John's use of the religion metaphor is clever and provocative. I don't want to say I agree with it entirely because I think it casts religion in a bad light. And I don't think just because something has qualities that are rooted in faith, that are not grounded in evidence, but that are something that you simply believe on faith, doesn't mean it's all bad. Yeah. The religious institutions and the cultural inheritances of religious practice of prayer and faith and study and worship and fellowship and all of that, these are not presumptively bad things. I mean, these are, so I take a little bit of issue because John, who I imagine is an atheist, and I'm a person who am not as religious as I used to be, but was baptized at the age of 40 as a born-again Christian. We have different relationships to religion, John and I. When he says it, he means it's an irrational, faith-based, no evidence, kind of just, belief like in a cult. And that's not how I think about the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where I was once a practicing member. On the other hand, what's he getting at? He's getting at impervious to evidence. Okay, the belief impervious to evidence. It will not be revised in the face of contradictory facts. Okay, he's getting at the hunt for heretics. We are the faithful. You are outside the faith. We're going to burn you at the stake. He's getting at the ritual, the obeisance, the prayer-like incantations of sentences like structural racism in America has led to a situation in which there is no respect for the Black body. I mean, that's gibberish. I'm sorry. To me, that's just like mumbo jumbo. That's just like magic words. I don't know what they're talking about in terms of real social process. It's just a call to the faithful. It's a call to prayer, this kind of thing. So I think there's some, it's a totalizing explanatory account. I mean, these are all things that are like what you could imagine religion being. Explains everything. All of the data are accounted for by this one theory, which of course means it explains nothing at all.
Okay. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. No, it's a great answer. And the last one, maybe just getting literally into, I think politics. Do you think that despite the sound call to reduce racism or police brutality, that the riots and excesses that we've seen could create a backlash to the cause for that, both within the communities that have been affected, or later on during the November election, if I don't know, well, basically in that sense, that it's going to create a backlash and say, well, we want to respect a lot of the protests, and those are good, but the excesses and riots should not be. Should be condemned more, because if not, there's going to be more calls to law and order to sort of have that effect later.
Yes, I do think there will be significant political consequences. I am not a political scientist. There are people who look at data and try to predict election results in some systematic way, and I'm not one of them. So what I say here is just based on my sort of common sense observation. I remember the 1960s. I'm actually old enough to remember, the 1960s. I remember Nixon's first presidential campaign in 1968, and I remember his re-election campaign of 1972. I was 20 years old when Nixon was elected in 1968. And I remember the silent majority. I remember the reaction against the Vietnam War. The people who said, if you don't like this country, leave. You burn your draft card in defiance of the Selective Service Act when good American boys are going and dying and fighting in the jungles of Vietnam, then go to Canada if you want to and get the heck out. Now, of course, I mean, as an African American coming up in Chicago, I would have been in the camp of, anti-war and pro-civil rights and radical and whatnot as I was. But I think the consequences of that upheaval in American culture, which were very profound, feminism and the assassinations and the radical Black nationalism and the anti-war fervor, the Weather Underground, et cetera. I don't think there's any way to read American history without saying that there was a significant backlash against that. It had lasting effects on American culture for sure. Maybe at the end of the day, the radicals of the '60s won out a lot more than some of us might have wished that they had done. There's been a complete revolution in a lot of the sexual, gay rights and all this kind of thing. I'm not against it. My son's a gay man. I'm not against it, but I'm just saying it's been a sea change. The whole kind of normative culture has been shifted. But in any case, political backlash, I think there was. I mean, you could count. Nixon won in '68. He won in a landslide in 1972. Jimmy Carter is president, but then you have the Ronald Reagan revolution, which completely changes the thing. And even by the time Bill Clinton in '92 is getting elected, look what the Democratic Party has become. It's become a much more centrist and moderate party. So yeah, I fear. Yeah, I turn on Tucker Carlson every now and then. I'll admit it. I actually go to look to see what he's saying because I think he's a pretty interesting person commenting on American public affairs. I don't always agree with him, but I do sometimes agree with him. And he had a montage during the rioting where it was just one after another, 10 or 15 second clip of people running into people's stores, of people attacking and assaulting people, of people, of mayhem in American cities. Now, you can't tell me somebody sitting in a town of 100,000 people in Western Pennsylvania or Southeastern Ohio or something, watching that, identifies with the protesters. I don't believe that. I don't believe that for a minute. I think they're thinking, oh my God, my country's going to hell in a handbasket. Who are these people? So when the guy runs with a campaign that says, keep America great, make America great again, we're going to give you your country back. The New York Times and CNN are going to say he's a racist, but many, many, many millions of Americans are going to say, I'm not sure he's wrong. This is my opinion. I could be wrong about it. But that's what I fear. I fear that the people who are not interested in the project that I was advocating a moment ago, which is embed African-American aspiration within the larger American project. There are people, white people, who are not interested in that. That they are, it's not my problem, forget about it. Those are not my people. That's not my country over there where all that trouble is going on. Those people are only given aid and comfort, it seems to me, by much of what it is that we've seen it transpire. So I do worry about that. Defund the cops. So the radicals say defund the cops, and then the more moderate but progressive and left of center politicians say, well, no, they don't really mean that. So now your argument is to try to translate a slogan into a program about police reform that involves not really defunding, but shifting the money around or whatever. And what's on the other side of that? The other side of that is the Trump mantra, which is we stand with our police, we stand with our law enforcement, we stand with our cops, we stand with the people who went in to the collapsing buildings under 9/11, we stand with the people who respond toward the gunfire when they hear the gunfire going rather than away from the gunfire. We stand. I think that is the stronger political argument at the end of the day, compared to the radicals who want to defund the police and haven't thought through for a moment. I mean, have they got any idea with a Second Amendment, with as many millions of weapons as there are in circulation in the United States, what the state of nature in American cities would look like without any police officers? Have they got any idea what they're asking for?
Yeah. Well, thank you very, very much for all those great answers. This question, I mean, just to conclude, the question is not here, but just going back to the beginning, I think of our conversation. As I mentioned, that I'm in love with the American dream, and I'm in love with the project that it is, and I think it's very close to what you're describing of all of us coming together. That should be the project going. That it's never hasn't been perfect or might never be perfect, but that's, if we don't do it together, we won't do it at all. And I think that that's a good, the American dream itself is a good mantra of all of us moving forward. And I personally think that the dream itself, even though we see all this mayhem and polarization and all that I think that the dream is alive and well nowadays. I don't know. So I wanted to ask you if you think that the American dream is alive and well and is achievable or not. What is your perspective on just the dream in general?
Yes, I do think the American dream is alive and well, in that, in this globalized environment where we live, where people move around so much, where I'm an economics professor, so I teach graduate students, and they come from South Asia and East Asia and Latin America and Europe and whatnot, and many of them stay on and have careers here in the United States, and they prosper. This is where everybody wants to come. That's the reason why you have a immigration issue in the first place, that people want to come and make their lives here. I think objectively, when you look at the evolution of the social status of various different identifiable groups, ethnic, racial, immigrant groups and populations, including immigrants from Africa and from the Caribbean, what you see is people moving up the ladder of social position and achieving, starting businesses, entering the professions, their children doing better than they are, and so on. I don't want to overlook the fact that there are serious issues for many immigrant populations, but gosh, Harvard is being sued by Asian Americans for only being 20% Asian and not 40% Asian. That's kind of what it comes to. For crying out loud, I read books. I read about the social lives of various immigrant populations. There's this very impressive book by two sociologists, Min Zhou and Jennifer Lee. Min Zhou is a Chinese descent, and Jennifer Lee is of, I think she's of Korean descent. But in any case, these two Asian American sociologists, and they interview a couple hundred families in Southern California, Korean and Filipino and Chinese and Vietnamese, and they're trying to find what's going on. Of course, these various populations differ from one another, but one of the things that's going on is that they're working modest jobs, but they have dreams about their kids penetrating into becoming doctors and engineers and going to Ivy League schools and whatnot. And those dreams come true for a lot of those kids. Or give another example, you got this huge argument in New York City about the specialized exam schools, the Bronx High School of Science and the Stuyvesant and all of this, which are like impossible to get into because you have to be in the 95th percentile of the test takers or something like that to qualify for admission. And the problem is that whereas 75 years ago they were heavily Jewish, today they're heavily Chinese and other Asian descent. And when you look at the proportion of these kids who qualify for school lunch assistance or something like that, it's like 50 or 60% of the kids. So they're not, some Hong Kong family that's coming over here with $5 million and buying a townhouse in Brooklyn or something. They're working class people who are showing that it's an open society and that the sky is the limit here. And as I think that is basically true.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Glenn.